All right, hey everyone, Toby with DuraSeal back again. We're going to talk a little bit about matching color on a job site when you don't know what the color is and you need to match it. So full disclosure, I know what this color is because I put it down. What I thought I'd do, this is antique brown. So I'm going to show you guys how I would match it, not using antique brown. So a lot of times where people get locked into their thinking is they think they need to know what was used to create a color match, and you don't. You just need to get something that looks like it. So as I said, this is antique brown. So I'm going to show you what I would do to match this color if I didn't know it. And I'm not going to use antique brown as one of the colors. So the fan deck is a great tool to get started. And again, I'm not going to use the antique brown. So I would take the fan deck and just spread it out and start looking at what I think is close. Like, okay, coffee brown doesn't look too bad. Dark walnut doesn't look too bad. It actually looks really good there. Let's see, golden brown, Jacobines, kind of in the right tone, just a little too green, medium brown. Spice brown's a little too red. So for this example, I'm going to use spice brown as my base color. So we can clearly see it's too red, but I think I can work with that. So to start, I'm going to just take spice brown right out of the can, which is here. And I'll put a little spot to see how it looks on this floor here today in this lighting. Because when you're doing any kind of color matching at someone's house, you want to be doing it at their house in their lighting. So, and again, it's not that I think this is going to match here. This is just to get a baseline of where I'm starting from. So as we said, it looks kind of red. Everybody see that? Kind of more red and orange, but it looks about the right level of intensity. You know how dark it is. It looks pretty good. So to get rid of the red, the best thing to cut red is green. So the three colors that we make that have the most green in them, and this is really useful for red oak in general, is dark walnut, ebony, and Jacobine. So I'm going to add in one of those. Let's try dark walnut. I'm going to just mix them at a 1-to-1 ratio. And I'm going to put a little spot down and see what that looks like. So these cups have little measuring gradients on them. So I'm just going to pour to the lines. That's how I'm measuring these out.
Just real quick, I am going to double check on the audio here. I believe this is go, but if anybody in the online audience could just type in the Q&A panel to let me know that you can hear us, that would be great.
And so here I have dark walnut. I have already pre-shaken and stirred these, by the way. So again, I'm going to do a 1-to-1 ratio. 50-50, whatever you want to call that. Give it a little stir. And we're just going to take this and put it down and see what it looks like. So I think we're a little bit light. One of the things with color is the direction you're looking at it and the direction of the light source can affect how you see it. So what you guys are seeing from that side of the room might be different than what I'm seeing from this side of the room. So feel free to look around if you want. If you could try to stay off the panels, that would be helpful. But if you want to see it from like my perspective or anything. So I think that we're still too light. I still like the spice as a starting point. So I'm going to take this and set it aside, and I'm going to try the spice, and I'm going to mix it with Jacobine instead of the dark walnut now.
Is that 1-to-1?
The most green, and it's also a darker than the dark walnut. So that's what I'm trying to do to kind of try to get closer to that color. So
How do we know which stains have green?
I just verbally from me telling you, there's nothing on the can that says this color has a lot of green. But if you look through the colors, I mean, Jacobine. Oh no, you're fine. I love questions. It's never a problem. So Jacobine is, you know, it's got like a greenish tone. None of them specifically look green, but one, you know, ebony and dark walnut and Jacobine are all extremely popular, and red oak being the most popular floor in the country, or the most common floor in the country. Without even knowing it, people are cutting the red using green without maybe even knowing that the green's in there, but by their customer choices. So if you put Jacobine on white oak, you'll often notice that it almost has like a greenish cast. It's not nearly as popular on white oak as it is on red oak because the green starts to show through.
We'll give you a index today so that you can get more familiar with the colors.
So again, I'm going to do 1 part of Spice Brown, and we're going to introduce Jacobine into the mix.
And how precise are you getting with the measurement?
I mean, fairly close with the gradient marks, but I wouldn't say it's, to the drop or anything like that. Fairly close. When you mix a larger ratio, if you're doing a whole floor, you might be at a gallon to a gallon. You don't even need to measure at that point. Just come straight out of the can. I mean, even if one is an ounce over a gallon, you're not going to significantly affect the color because they're both dark browns. So we're doing some kind of subtle adjustments here. Oop. I'd say that's pretty darn close. How's it look from your guys' side?
Almost looks like the regular Spice Brown. A little bit darker.
Take a look around. Step around. Like I said, color can affect that. If your homeowner is standing like looking toward the window and your back is to the window, they're going to be seeing the color significantly different than you are.
Yes.
What do you guys think? So again, that was antique brown. I knew that. But this is hitting a match or close to a match without using that color. Generally, when talking to homeowners, I tried to avoid saying that we could, phrases like we could match it perfectly, but we get as close as we can. There's a big difference between those. A perfect match implies you can't tell the difference. Getting as close as you can means putting actual effort into getting it close. Like I said, the key takeaway is that you don't need to know the formula for what was made, just that you need to mix up things that look like it. So even if it was a 20-part mix, you might be able to hit it straight out of the can. Even if it's a color straight out of the can, you might be able to hit it with a 5-part mix. So the colors that I really like to play with on subtle changes, Sedona Red is great to add in red. White is great, not to make it lighter, but to make it more opaque. Some of the colors are more muddy than others. I call that where you don't have the clarity of grain like you have with some of these darker browns. So like English chestnut is a great example of a muddy color that we make. It's that orangey tone too, but it's also the difference between the open grain and the closed grain isn't as pronounced. You don't have that black open grain and the lighter closed grain. So that's very useful. The white to make it more muddy. Black is useful because it'll make it straight darker without really affecting the color other than making it darker. Neutral is great to make something lighter. So that's kind of my key working set. And then of course, starting with close to the base color, use the fan deck, pick whichever one is closest. And usually I'll go a little bit on the lighter side, but even a little bit on the darker side is fine too, because we can always lighten it with neutral. So this next one.
Real quick, can you also talk about how water popping affects the color?
Absolutely. So this whole panel's been water popped. And just as an FYI, our fan deck is shown water popped. That's a change from previous generations of the fan deck. So both sides, the red and the white oak sides, are shown water popped. So water popping will make the floor, the color richer and darker. However, it affects different colors differently. So where some colors have a very subtle difference between water popped and not, some colors are like night and day, the difference. So you can affect the color of your stain and your match by water popping or not water popping. So if you think of the right color, but it seems too dark and you're already water popped, maybe sand it smooth again and try the same color, because maybe that'll be the match for what you were doing. Again, we're operating under the assumption that we don't know what the previous person did. So we can try the color both ways to see where we hit the match.
And application techniques, will that affect the color?
It can slightly. So if we divide into 2 categories: hand application, meaning literally rubbing on with the rag or putting it on with a pad or putting it on with the lamb's wool, versus buffer application. Generally, the buffer application, if anything, is going to look a little bit lighter. That has to do with using less product. So while that seemingly is a win, using less product, you want to be careful, because you lose some of the sealing capabilities of the quick coat when you use less. So your first coat of finish won't build as nicely over a buffed floor as it will over a hand applied floor. The flip side of that too is that a buff floor will often be smoother, especially if you water pop first, because the buffing is smoothing out the raised grain. So everything, there's a balance between all of it. But if you are buffing, you want to be sure to be using enough stain. You don't want to try to stretch the stain as far as it'll go. Okay, to move on. So the next color up there, this is dark gray, straight out of the can. And again, I was going to show how I would proceed matching it, not using the dark gray color. So I'm going to shift my knee pad area up there. Knee pad meaning boxes and carpet. And so again, the fan deck would be the place I'd start. We're not going to use the dark gray. So there's classic gray. That classic gray is a little more translucent than what I'm seeing there. Country white, you know, white, but white, it's very muddy. So as this color is. So, and then black. So none of them, if we exclude the dark gray, look particularly close to the color, but grays are pretty much always going to be derivatives of black and white. So we're going to start with black and white. So if we use true black and country white, which is those two, I think we can get pretty close. So anybody want to take a guess at a ratio that they think to try first? No. 2 parts of which one? 2 true black. All right, let's try it. This one is not, I'm gonna shake that for me for a while. I think I got a.
Watching, we do have a video that we will be posting as well on how to properly mix your sage.
So you can make it lighter with neutral without affecting the color itself, other than it getting lighter. If you're making it darker with any color, generally you're also veering off in slightly different directions. So I'd say it's easier to make it lighter, but both can work adequately.
You said we're doing 2 parts of
The black is always harder to see because it stays, it clings to the side. We have a pretty decent amount of sediment on this one. Yes, so much so that I think I'm gonna pause this and we're gonna move on to the maple. And keep talking about that.
well,
So,
Dave is going to step in.
Yeah. So on the maple, we're not actually going to stain the maple, but I was just going to talk about some techniques. It's very common for maple to get a blotchy look when stained. Everybody seen that before? The uneven staining. So one of the things is just the perception of it. So we often talk about blotchiness. And if we say to the homeowner, I can stain your floor, but it's going to be really blotchy, that doesn't sound that appealing. Just by changing the terminology, and if we say the marbling in your floor is going to be really nice, suddenly the same look becomes a positive. So that's just, you know, portraying your work. If you set the stage for this is going to look bad, they're going to expect it to look bad. If you set the stage for you're going to make it look as nice as you can, it just changes the whole conversation. Beyond that, a lot of what we've done with sanding in the last 20 to 30 years with rotational sanders, and by rotational sanders, I mean multi-disc sanders, whatever brand they're from, or whether it's a buffer attachment or a standalone tool. As we sand maple smoother and smoother, we're actually going to increase the look of the marbling. So the better you sand it, generally the worse the stain it's going to look on that blotchiness. So if we go back in time to yesteryear, the techniques that we used to use were we didn't buff the floor at all. So we would sand the floor with the big machine to like 120 grit. And then the edges are always going to look different because of the rotational nature of the edges. So we would hand sand the edges. And for me, it was going to be 60 grit on a block, hand sanded with the grain. And that's what was going to match the 120 texture of the big machine. You now have a rough floor but it's rough uniformly with lines going with the grain, and the stain will take much more evenly than if you were to sand it smooth, you know, like to 120 or 150 on a multi-disc. That's one of the techniques that you can use. Another is adding a little bit of white into your color will make it more opaque. So any color, let's just say we wanted to stain the maple floor ebony, adding in a small amount of white, and by a small amount, like 10%, we're not actually trying to make a gray color or, you know, get it toward the white, but the white is so opaque because the pigment that it will make the ebony more opaque, and it actually will hide some of the marbling through the lack of translucence. So does that make sense? Sure. Yeah. So maple has a couple things different than the oak that we're so commonly sanding, whether it's red or white oak. So one is the lack of open grain. So both red and white oak have the spring wood and the summer wood, or the open and closed grain. Maple doesn't really have that. It's uniform. So when you sand it, you create like this smooth surface across. Even on a well sanded oak floor, when you do your first coat of finish, some of the finish is going to drop into the open grain and create some texture. Maple doesn't really get that. It stays smooth. So the grain itself is different. And then the blotch occurs from what we can't see in the wood, basically. It's the differences in the growth of the tree, but we can't see it like we can the open grain of the oak. Maple can pose some other problems too, even just on natural with the coating of it, because it tends to show any coating flaws due to the nature of the color being light, and again, the smoothness of the wood. So some people struggle with making the finish coats look good, even on natural. There again, just using best practice, making sure that you're properly applying each coat, and intercoat abrading between each coat is going to be your best practice to avoid the look of maple with uneven coatings. Any questions? Lynn is diligently stirring our stain here.
A little bit more to go.
Yep.
We'll give everybody a little sneak peek here into our other video that we're posting. Here are two colors, you know, came out of the same pan. It's red mahogany. This one was not stirred properly, and this one was. And you can see the difference there. So what Lynn is doing definitely is needed.
You want to pull a question off the list?
I have a question when it comes to buffing on stain.
Sure.
We don't do it too much because I have a problem cutting in and getting burn marks.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good way to do that?
So when you've done it, were you cutting in first and then buffing after? So my personal preference is I like to buff first, walk right onto the buffed area, cut in my edge, wipe the edge, and then buff off the stain color. And that's where I've had the best success. Yep, absolutely. And I've personally never seen it burn in the edge that way. Where I've seen where it burns in the edge a lot if I do the cutting in first. I have plenty of contractors that tell me they do it each of those ways with success, and I totally believe them, but just in my experience that the buffing it on, leaving it wet, go in, cut in the edge, wipe the edge, and then buff off, and that'll get rid of your footprints as well. That's what I find works best.
When you're doing like a repair, what is the best way to blend in stain when you're fixing an area before? Like, you know, we're talking about the
Sure.
color match here, but what's the best way to blend?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take a blend or a repair as if we know what the original stain color was. Like say it's work that we did a month ago and they damaged the floor and we're back to fix it for them on work that we did. If you need to match the color, you'd refer back to what we're talking about over here on how to match a color. But let's say we know that the color was, in this case, antique brown. What I found the best way to do repairs is, depending on the scope of the repair, sometimes you're better off to sand a whole room and cut off in a doorway than you are to try to just do a part of it. Well, let's say it's a relatively small area that goes across 3 boards. I like to tape off around those 3 boards exactly, sand, scrape, get back to raw wood, do whatever I did in the initial process as far as water sanding grits and water popping. So I would go finish sanding with my sand grit. I'd water pop like I did, stain with the same color, let that dry, build up a couple coats, and then maybe do another final coat over the entire area, the entire house again to blend it perfectly.
We did have a question too. Why use DuraSeal for floors instead of Minwax? Can DuraSeal stain be mixed with Minwax stain if I'm in a pinch?
Sure. So the DuraSeal mixing with Minwax is commonly done. We do not recommend doing that. It's not, nothing's going to fail instantly, but what you're doing is you're watering down the properties of DuraSeal that make it such a good sealer. Minwax is mineral spirits based. That's what the min in Minwax actually means. The name was originally mineral spirits and wax, and while there's no longer wax in it, it's still primarily mineral spirits. Quick Coat is linseed based, and linseed is a very effective sealer because it's a liquid, but it's considered a solid in this scenario because it doesn't evaporate out. It doesn't, when it dries in the wood. So it stays in the wood, and that's what gives it such a good seal. What was the first part of the question? Why use DuraSeal for floors?
Yeah, why DuraSeal for floors instead of.
Sure, I kind of touched on it there. It's the effectiveness of the sealer, the fact that it's linseed based. Our colors tend to be a richer, darker color, and then the linseed base makes it a super effective sealer to build your coats up and over.
Do any of the quick coat stains require more than an overnight dry before you can finish them?
Sure, we get the question a lot. How long does it take for the stain to dry? And it's a more complicated answer than just saying a set amount of time because there are different environmental factors. So if it's 34 degrees in your house, I don't know, probably won't ever dry. So I can't give you a time. If it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity, you're outside of comfortable living conditions. So again, I can't give you a specific time. So what I like to see is overnight, and overnight does not mean from 11:59 to 12:01, but reasonable working hours. Let's say staining it by 5 till 9 the next morning or 8 the next morning. I like overnight. I like in good conditions. So good conditions to me means where we're comfortable. I'm comfortable about 65 to 75 degrees. So that's where the floor is comfortable, and that's where the stain's going to dry effectively. In addition to that, the humidity should be at a level that we're comfortable at, so not 100%. And then I like to see some type of airflow, preferably airflow going across the floor. So it doesn't need to be a special fan, but just a little oscillating fan, something that can clear solvent fumes coming up and out of the floor off of the surface of the floor. There's a particular phenomenon where the solvent comes up and out, and then it sits on the floor, and it actually prevents more solvent from coming up and out, and it prevents it from finishing drying. So just a little bit of airflow going across will knock that away and allow the stain to continue drying. Yep. And I think we're ready to go back to our color matching here. So we were going to try 2 parts of True Black to 1 part of the Country White. And I'm just going to take a quick guess here that we're going to be really, really dark with that. Still want to do the same one though? Or you want to?
Let's see what it looks like first.
Sure.
And one of the questions was, what's the best way to mix stain colors?
Just into a container in a way that you can measure. I mean, I've done the bottom of a water bottle and into a tray. When you're doing ratios, if it's 1-to-1, it doesn't matter what the one is. It could be 1 teaspoon, 1 cup, 1 gallon, 1 55-gallon drum. As long as the other one's the same size, you're going to have a 1-to-1 ratio. So I like to do samples not in tiny amounts, so not like a teaspoon, because when I take a little dip out, I'd like to keep using the same cup to adjust the color. So if I do teaspoons and I take a dip, it's all gone. So I kind of have to start over. But I also don't want to have a gallon of stain at the end of this if if it's not the right direction. So a reasonable amount, a few ounces per part. So we're going to put this down. And we're dark. So I'm going to even us out to 1-to-1. And then I'm going to go to 2-to-1. And I think we're still going to be dark. Black is such a pervasive color that it really takes over when you put it in anything. Yeah, yeah. But you can see we're moving in the right direction. So in the interest of not overflowing this cup, I'm going to take half of this and pour it in here, and then I'm going to double the ratio once again to 4-to-1. that make sense? I'm not going to do half of it, but so. Whoa. So even though it doesn't look like it at this moment, I think that's actually going to be it because this is dry and that's wet. But I'll bet that that'll lighten down to, or, you know, dry into the right match. You have to keep in mind too, you know, the difference between wet and dry stain can really affect when you're trying to match. If you match it perfectly while wet, oftentimes it'll dry slightly different. So if there's finish on what you're trying to match, usually the wet stain will look like the dry stain with finish on it. You know, usually those two are very similar. So, but I think that that's going to be very close, or maybe just need a touch of the black again, or maybe even a touch of neutral or classic gray to try to remove some of the opaqueness, but that's going to be pretty darn close when it dries. So, any other questions?
We did have some more questions submitted ahead of time.
Do you want to do those now, or?
We'll do just a couple more now, because they're relevant to the same. One, you know, penetrating colors aren't going to be around, but one of the questions is, can quick coat colors be mixed with the penetrating colors that they still have?
Sure. So our old product, penetrating finish, Quick Coat came around in 2001, and it's really just a modification of the penetrating finish. It's a drier package added to the penetrating finish. So they absolutely can be intermixed in any ratio, but I would generally just defer to the penetrating finish dry times. So that's more like 24 hours rather than overnight, again, with good conditions.
Speaking of that, another question is, are there any stains you can't mix together, and any with longer dry times?
Sure. So very generally speaking, darker stains take longer to dry, but more accurately, higher pigmented stains take longer to dry. So the colors that are intense in color, so white is one of the ones that often comes up as taking slightly longer. Dark, true black, ebony, the darker colors. But again, overnight with good conditions and airflow should give you a dry floor. There's a particular way to test if the stain is still wet. And note, I said if it's still wet, not if it's dry. So the vacuum test, if anybody's been vacuuming before they do their first coat, has anybody ever pulled liquid stain up out of the floor, like out of the gaps in the floor, out of the grain? Have you ever seen that? If you can get liquid stain up, it's not dry. Fact. So you can test that with a vacuum. Just put it right down on the floor, the butt ends, the side ends, the sides, and even the open grain. And if you can pull liquid stain up and out of the floor, it's absolutely not dry. Not getting it out doesn't actually mean that it's dry. It just means that you didn't pull any out. So that's why I like the overnight, the good conditions, the fan, and passing the vacuum test the next morning. So.
And what causes the longer dry time?
Well, longer dry times can be caused by multiple factors. So in the case of the colors, it's the higher pigment load, but cooler temperatures can increase dry times. Higher humidity can increase dry times. Certain woods can even take longer to dry if they absorb more of the stain into it. Let's see what else. Your application method can affect dry times. So like generally buffing stain on tends to put it on a little bit thinner. That'll speed up the dry time, or, you know, reverse of that is the hand application can actually be a little bit slower on the dry time because you're generally putting more of the product down, leaving more of it in the floor. That's about all I can think of.
And how long, the last one I'll ask is, how long is the shelf life?
Officially, it's 2 years. That's per our label, but nearly all of the colors will stay good fairly indefinitely. I have stuff on my shelf at home from when I was still contracting. I haven't contracted in 6 years. And I actually still have some gallons, and we lost gallons in Illinois in 2008. So they are 14 years old, and I wouldn't hesitate for 1 second to use them on a floor tomorrow. They are absolutely still good. White is an exception to that. And that's an unopened can, by the way. When they're open, they can start to go bad a little more quickly. Most of the colors still won't. White will go bad after a few years, even unopened. And if you open the can and there's an airspace in it, it'll tend to go bad fairly quickly in a matter of months. So white, you don't want to save for extended amounts of time. It definitely will go bad faster than any other color. And some of the grays, particularly dark gray, have white in it. So they kind of, by proxy, they get that same effect.
Sure, I got a quick question, just on stuff that I've seen. I personally haven't done this, but what are your thoughts on, say, using tinted seal to lighten or darken your stain?
Sure. I like tints. We don't actually make that any tints, but I like tinting in general. It's what you use to tint with can be very important, because we would look at anything being tinting our clear finish as a contaminant in the finish. So if you had a failure, like where it peeled, we would look at your tint as the contaminant that caused it. So you would want to work with your manufacturer to find a product that is safe to use with their products.
Okay, well, we will go ahead, we'll wrap this one up. We are going to be taking some more video today that we'll be posting later on social media. So if you do have a question, let us know. And we will have a question and answer session here at about 2:30 Central Time. So feel free to email in your questions. We'll be covering those then. So have a great day, everyone. We'll see you in a couple hours.